Hello there and welcome back. In this video, we're going to tackle our 7th compositing fundamental and go over the theory of lighting and how it relates to compositing. By far, the biggest impact that lighting will have is when it comes to element selection. This can be a CG render, it could be a photograph, it could be a video. Any element that we're compositing into our shot needs to have the exact same lighting characteristics as our footage. If these do not match, your shot is not going to feel real. So let's look at the characteristics of light that we need to match when we're selecting our elements. We have the light direction, the light quality, and the light intensity. And this list is applied to every single light that you can see in your footage. So let's dive in and start looking at these more closely. We'll start with light direction. Now, light direction is exactly what it sounds like. You need to make sure that your lights are facing the right way and are positioned correct relative to the object that's being lit. A lot of the times, you'll be able to tell this by the direction of the shadows. In this instance, I looked at the rock in the foreground in the bottom left of frame, and I saw that its shadow was going mostly horizontally. It was going up a little bit, and so I roughly matched that in 3D to make sure that my light was going in the correct direction. But you'll notice that it appears that the shadows shift a little as we go from left to right in the frame. All of those rocks on the right are being very front lit. And we know there's only one sun, so what does this mean? Is our lighting incorrect? Well, let's take a look at this sphere render I did. You'll see that on the left side, we're seeing much more of the shadow side of our objects, where on the right side, it's entirely front lit. So the directionality of your lighting not only depends on the overall scene lighting, but also specifically where in your scene it's placed. Because as objects in this instance moved further right, we saw more of the side that the sun was hitting, making it feel more front lit. For the sake of example, I made a duplicate of this statue in 3D space and moved it back towards those rocks, which appear to be more front lit. And you can see our render appears to be more front lit as well. It's not because we've moved the light or made an additional one, it's just the matter of us seeing more of the side that's being hit by the sun. Now let's take a look at how the statue feels when it's lit incorrectly in our scene, where the lighting direction is very wrong. Clearly, this doesn't feel realistic. This looks like a top-down spotlight sort of effect. It doesn't match the left to right nature of our plate. And the only thing I changed in this was the lighting. Everything else was kept exactly the same, so you can see just how big this lighting direction impact is. Let's take a look at another example. Now this is starting to look a little bit better, but we still have a major problem with this render. The light is facing the wrong direction. It's still going horizontally, but instead of our shadow being cast from left to right, it's being cast from right to left. I see a lot of newer compositors making this mistake, and it's an easier one to make because if you're just looking at a glance at it, it doesn't feel horribly off. There's something weird, and you may have a hard time putting your finger on it, but what's weird in this instance is certainly the light direction. And in this instance, we have a render that is way too front lit. This looks like it could potentially be more appropriate if it was on the back right section of our screen, but looking at our foreground rock and comparing the direction of our shadow on her arm, this is certainly not correct. Let's try pushing it back a little bit now and see what our statue looks like with the light behind it. If you look at the shadow that's being cast, it's in the same relative direction as our foreground rock guide there, but this still doesn't quite feel right. And why is that? Because our shadows look fairly close. Well, if you look at the rocks that are in our foreground just beyond that practical shadow, you can see that there's still a good amount of front light happening on them. And we're getting way more shadow on the right side of our statue than we're seeing in the practical footage. So we're going to need to make this not quite so backlit. And now here we have the final version of our shot. We have that nice front lighting back. The shadow direction still matches pretty accurately, and I think this looks really good. And so once you have this quote unquote correct lighting, some people will play with it in CG to make it a little more visually pleasing, and it's okay to cheat it a little bit. But if you start doing too much cheating, it's going to start to feel compy and unrealistic. So it's just something to be aware of. And that wraps up lighting direction. Let's go ahead and start talking about our light quality. When we're talking about light quality, we're really talking about the quality of the shadows that a given light will cast. How sharp or hard will those shadows be? And that sharpness of your shadow is determined by these two factors: the size of your light and the distance of your light to the subject. And why are these the two factors that affect our light quality? Let's take a look at this quick graph here where we have a very small light and a large area light. The sharpness of our shadows has everything to do with how parallel the rays of light are that are hitting our object. For our point light, there's not any other place that our rays of light can be coming from. It's one single point in space. And so we don't have any overlapping rays of light. And so the shadow is very harsh because it's either being obstructed from all the rays or being hit by all the rays. In the case of our area light, we have a much larger surface area that our rays can be emit from. Again, we'll assume we're casting light in all directions from our source, and you'll see that this larger size introduces more variation in the direction of the light rays that reach our object. There are areas that light rays from point A can illuminate that point B cannot, and there are also areas that point B can illuminate that point A cannot. This disparity in what the individual rays can illuminate creates that gradient in our soft shadows. Let's take a look at this in 3D just so it's a little more clear. So we have an area light here in 3D, and this is going to be a good way to visualize this. And so you'll notice that as we grow our light source, our shadow continues to get softer and softer. And as we shrink our light source, you can see that softening start to go away till it's very small. It's very sharp like that. There's a couple cool things you can notice from this. Notice how much harsher the line is here than it is back here. You can see this gradual softening because as the distance between your object and the object it's casting a shadow on increases, the softer the shadow will be. So the closer they are, the sharper the shadow will be. And like we said, the size of our light is not the only factor. Let's go ahead and zoom way out, and we can compare how the distance of lights affect the quality of their shadows. In this example, I have two lights that are the exact same size, but they're at two very different distances to our subject. These shadows are very different despite these being the exact same size. Let's zoom in here. This light that is near is very soft, when the light of the exact same size, once moved back, is suddenly very harsh. And again, this has everything to do with how parallel our light rays are, because we're essentially changing the amount of overlap that can happen between our light rays as we move our light source further away. This is why the sun's shadow is so sharp when it's not being blocked by clouds, because obviously the sun is a huge, huge source of light, but it's so far away that the shadows get very sharp. If the sun was closer, not only would we all be incinerated, but all of our shadows would also be very soft. So let's take a look at our example here again. We've matched the quality of the lighting. The shadow hardness is consistent with the footage. Let's take a look at what this would look like if we had an overly soft light in the exact same position. So you can see this doesn't really make sense within our scene. Our lighting direction is correct, but this feels like it was lit in a more overcast environment, and it just doesn't read as realistic because our light quality is not correct. And let's use this as an opportunity to talk about diffusion a little bit, because we just talked about how hard the sun's shadows were. Well, when it goes through clouds, or when a movie light goes through any sort of diffusion filter, what it's traveling through essentially becomes a new light source and rescatters all of the rays of light, so they're no longer moving in a parallel direction, and therefore it softens our shadows. Something else to note when you're dealing with CG in particular is that your direct light can have a lighting quality of very harsh shadows or very soft shadows, but the indirect light that is bouncing off different sources is always soft, like in this example here. You will never see a harsh indirect source. And again, this is because when the light hits the ground, the rays are scattering and not parallel with one another, creating that soft effect. And finally, we're moving on to light intensity. Light intensity is very straightforward. It's that our lights need to match the appropriate levels of brightness. In this instance, we only have one light, and obviously this looks very wrong. And this is typically the light characteristic that for CG renders, compositors have the most control over. CG renders can be split out into different light groups, and you can very easily fine-tune the intensity of each of your individual lights. Whereas the light direction and shadow quality is very difficult, if not impossible, to modify on CG renders. In this example, our main key light has an appropriate level of brightness, but there was a secondary light added. There's a bit of a backlight in there. And clearly there's no secondary source of light in this footage, and so we need to turn it off in order for it to look correct. And modifying the intensity of that to 0 makes this sit very nicely again. We've been mostly looking at lighting in regards to 3D, and we've done that just because it's a little easier to show the nuances of the lighting characteristics when we have a consistent shot to be comparing against. But I cannot stress enough how important lighting is when it comes to matching your various elements in 2D. We've already actually done this a little bit in week 3 when we were selecting a background for our green screen shot, and we made sure we were matching all of those lighting characteristics. Now let's take a look at some examples that are maybe not so great, and we can talk about why they feel wrong. And before we get into these not so great examples, I just want to disclaim I'm not trashing these artists' work. A lot of the times when shots like this happen, there are outside factors that contribute to shots getting rushed and just trying to get something out there to hit a deadline. So I'm not ripping on these artists. I'm just trying to show some real examples of shots that made it to television that I think could be improved through better lighting. And so in this instance, we have a shot from The Walking Dead, and the number one thing that jumps out to me is that the quality of lighting is very different between the foreground and the background. This was very clearly a green screen shot, and you can see the harsh shadows on that matte painting in the background that are getting cast on the ground. And the types of clouds that are up there seems to imply that this element is a bright sunny day. But if you look at our main character here, he has no sharp shadows. And he doesn't really have any shadows, but if you look at our background plate, you can see the right side is clearly getting hit by light, and the left side is in shadow, but he's just uniformly front lit. Looks like there's a specular hit on the top left of his forehead, and I think amongst other things, that's the biggest reason that this shot doesn't work. And here we can see a still from one of my favorite movies, The Room, and you can see that the lighting from the foreground to the background is flipped. The light is coming from right to left in our background, but it's coming from left to right in our foreground. And the quality of light also doesn't seem to quite align. It feels like it could be a little bit harsher in the background than in our foreground. You could get away with it if you're saying that it's bounce light, but there's nothing in the scene that's brightly illuminated that would be bouncing this light back. So again, when we're selecting elements for our comps, we need to make sure that these 3 factors are in place and consistent from our background to our foreground to our midground. Everything we're putting together needs to have consistent lighting. And if you have an element that has maybe 2 of the 3 of these characteristics, you need to ask yourself if you're going to be able to fudge that last one. In terms of light direction and light quality, honestly, it's pretty difficult to do depending on exactly what the lighting is. So that's just something to keep in mind. Light intensity is probably the easiest, but it still can be tricky if you're trying to make a very overexposed image very dark. And that wraps up our compositing fundamental of lighting. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.